The stagecoach lurched and groaned as it rolled over a stretch of sun-baked road, its wheels throwing up ribbons of ochre dust that curled like smoke in the waning light. Inside, Clara Mae Hollister sat with her gloved hands folded tightly over a small carpet-bag, her knuckles pale as bone beneath the thin leather. The hem of her dress, once her sister's Sunday best, had gathered dust at every stop, and the faint scent of lavender clung stubbornly to its faded threads, a reminder of a life that wasn't hers to live. She kept her gaze low, as though eye contact with the driver or the two strangers seated across from her might unravel the fragile composure she had stitched together for this journey. Outside the window, the prairie spread endlessly, a rust-colored sea beneath a bruised sky. The air smelled of earth and wind, sharp and wild, and it pressed through the cracks of the coach like an unseen spirit. Clara had never traveled this far from home, and with every mile, her sense of belonging shrank until she felt as small as a moth lost in a storm. She was not meant to be here, and she knew it. That thought had clung to her since the day Eleanor laughed, a bright, effortless laugh, and shook her head at their parents' pleading. Eleanor had been chosen by the man who waited at the end of this journey, his letters filled with simple promises of warmth and steadiness. But Eleanor, with her fine features and sunlit hair, had no interest in becoming a rancher's wife, no wish to be carried away from the modest excitement of town life. Clara remembered the way Eleanor had stood by the window that evening, candlelight haloing her golden curls, and declared, "I'd sooner marry the wind than bury myself in the dust with some stranger." Their father's jaw tightened, their mother's tears glistened, but nothing softened Eleanor's resolve. The Hollisters were a family of limited means, their dignity more fragile than their savings, and so Clara was summoned, gently but firmly, to take her sister's place. The decision had not been debated, it was simply understood. Clara, who had always been quiet, dutiful, and forgettable, would be sent in her sister's stead. The coach slowed as it descended into a small valley, the outline of a town emerging through the evening haze. A single lantern flickered in the window of the general store, its yellow glow stretching over the dusty street. Buildings crouched along either side of the main road like tired animals, and the wind carried with it the distant murmur of voices and the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Clara's stomach knotted as she clutched the bag tighter, its meager contents a testament to her life. 2 dresses, a comb, a worn Bible, and a photograph of her parents. She felt the tremor of the stagecoach halt beneath her boots, and the driver's calloused hand swung the door open. She stepped down into the dirt, the coolness of dusk brushing her face. The air smelled of horses, lamp oil, and wood smoke, and somewhere a dog barked in the distance. For a moment, she stood frozen, unsure which direction to turn, until she saw him. Silas Boone was leaning against a hitching post at the edge of the street, his broad shoulders outlined by the fading light. He wore a weathered coat that had seen too many winters, and a hat pulled low, shadowing a face carved by sun and years of quiet endurance. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, ashamed of the disappointment she imagined flickering in his eyes. But if Silas noticed her plainness, he gave no sign. He straightened, removed his hat in a brief gesture of respect, and offered his hand. "Miss Hollister," he said, his voice low and even, carrying a calm that startled her. Clara swallowed hard, took his hand, and found it warm and calloused. She had no words, only a nod. The townsfolk had gathered in small clusters, and she felt their eyes upon her, heavy as stones. A whisper floated from somewhere near the store porch. "That ain't the one he ordered." Another voice chuckled softly. Clara's stomach clenched, but she kept her chin level, her mother's advice echoing in her ears. Asterisk, never let them see you cry. Asterisk. Silas guided her to his wagon, lifting her bag with ease, and they left the murmuring town behind. The road out was lined with mesquite trees, their twisted branches clawing at the evening sky. Silence settled between them, but it was not unkind. Silas's presence was steady, like the rhythm of the horse's hooves, and Clara found herself breathing a little easier. When he noticed her shiver, he wordlessly reached behind the seat, retrieved a woolen blanket, and draped it over her shoulders. His gesture, simple yet deliberate, lodged itself in her memory like a small ember of warmth. The Boone ranch revealed itself in the dimming light, a sprawl of dark silhouettes against the horizon, a barn crouched near a sprawling corral, a modest house with a single lamp glowing in the front window. The scent of hay and horses hung thick in the air. Clara followed Silas up the porch steps, her boots creaking against the old wood. The door swung open to reveal a woman with sharp eyes and a firm set to her mouth. She was older than Clara, her auburn hair streaked with silver, and though her expression was guarded, there was no cruelty in her gaze. "This is my sister, Missy," Silas said. Missy Boone extended a hand, her grip firm. "Welcome," she said, though her tone carried the weight of a question unspoken. Clara felt herself shrink under that scrutiny, but offered a polite smile. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pine, soap, and kerosene. The furnishings were plain but sturdy. A table scarred from years of use, a hearth lined with polished stones, and curtains faded by sun. Clara's room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the corral. She placed her bag on the dresser, feeling the ache of dislocation settle deeper into her bones. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to coyotes sing in the distance. The loneliness pressed heavy against her chest, sharper than she'd imagined. She thought of Eleanor, who was likely sitting in their family's parlor now, laughter spilling easily from her lips, while Clara lay in a stranger's house at the far edge of the world. She turned on her side and clutched the photograph of her parents, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure anyone would hear. Morning brought no reprieve, only work. Clara rose early and dressed in a faded calico dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons as she heard movement in the kitchen. Determined to be useful, she joined Missy, who was already bustling over a skillet. Missy raised a brow, but handed her a bowl of potatoes to peel. The quiet between them was not unfriendly, and by the time Silas came in from the barn, Clara had managed a modest breakfast. He thanked her with a nod, his voice low, and she caught a fleeting glance of approval in Missy's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something. The days fell into rhythm. Clara took on chores without being asked, feeding chickens, mending linens, scrubbing floors until her hands were raw. Silas watched her work with a quiet attentiveness that made her chest tighten. He never hovered, never ordered, but his presence was always steady, like the hum of cicadas in the heat of noon. Once, when a window latch in her room broke, she found it repaired the next morning, the edges sanded smooth. Another time, he appeared wordlessly at her side as she struggled with a heavy pail of water, taking it from her hands without comment. These small gestures accumulated like pebbles in a jar, unnoticed until one day they filled it. Yet the whispers followed her. In town, where she ventured once a week for supplies, Clara heard them. At the general store, Mrs. Tanner's sharp eyes darted over her dress, and a smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Not quite what we expected," she murmured to her husband as Clara passed. Shame burned Clara's cheeks, but she kept her head down, clutching the parcels tightly to her chest. On the wagon ride back, Silas said nothing, but she sensed he'd heard, too. The thought stung more than the gossip itself. One evening, after the day's labor had settled into dusk, Clara found herself on the porch, the boards cool beneath her bare feet. The sky was a wash of violet and gold, the first stars flickering faintly overhead. She wrapped her shawl tighter and leaned against the railing, letting the silence wrap around her. Footsteps creaked behind her, and Silas appeared, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. They stood side by side, sipping quietly, the scent of coffee mingling with the sweet aroma of prairie grass carried on the wind. Clara stole a glance at him, his profile etched against the fading light, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt something unfamiliar stir within her, a glimmer of safety, of being seen. The coyotes howled again, but tonight their song sounded less like mourning and more like company. Silas glanced at her, his eyes warm beneath the shadow of his hat, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Clara returned it, her heart settling into a rhythm she hadn't known she needed. Sometimes the loneliest souls recognize each other long before they learn to speak. Clara didn't yet understand why this thought comforted her so deeply, but as she stood there with him beneath the stars, She felt the first fragile threads of belonging weave quietly around her heart. Clara rose each morning with the sun, her body falling into the rhythm of ranch life, as if it had been waiting all along for this quiet, relentless order. She milked the cows before breakfast, her breath rising in pale clouds, and fetched water from the well while dew clung stubbornly to the grass. The days shaped her hands into callous tools, her back into a steady bow, and her spirit into something tougher than she had ever imagined. Yet in this crucible of labor, she found a strange peace. The ache of her muscles and the grit under her nails became a prayer, an offering. Silas noticed, though he never said so. His gaze would sometimes linger on her as she moved about the yard, as if he were memorizing the sight of her quiet persistence, and she found herself wondering if he had always been this kind of man, one who spoke sparingly, but listened with every part of himself. The ranch hands began to treat her with the same understated respect they showed Silas. They nodded when she passed, offered their hats in greeting, and occasionally slipped her a compliment that wasn't laced with mockery. Clara didn't know how to receive such gestures, so she simply smiled and carried on. It was Missy Boone, ever watchful, who broke the silence one afternoon while they shelled peas by the open window. "You're good for him," Missy said suddenly, her voice calm but firm. Clara froze, unsure if it was praise or warning. Missy's sharp eyes softened slightly. "He was a ghost of himself after our parents died. I worried he'd stay that way forever. But I see him look at you, and he's here again." The words left Clara's cheeks flushed with warmth she couldn't name, and she bent her head over the bowl, blinking quickly. Still, Eleanor's shadow followed her. Each time Clara heard her sister's name whispered in town, she felt herself shrink. At the general store, the gossips' tongues wagged freely. "Pretty thing. That sister. Shame she sent the plain one instead." Clara pretended not to hear, but their words burrowed deep. It wasn't only the gossip that hurt. It was her fear that Silas might share the sentiment, that he had settled for her out of obligation. These doubts clung to her even in the warmth of Silas's presence, feeding a quiet despair she could not shake. One evening, overwhelmed by the weight of these thoughts, she retreated to the barn long after the household had gone to bed. She sank onto a hay bale and buried her face in her hands, tears slipping through her fingers. The scent of hay and horse musk surrounded her, grounding her in a way the world outside never did. She hadn't heard him approach until his boots scuffed softly against the barn floor. Silas knelt in front of her, his hat in his hands, his expression grave, but not pitying. He didn't ask what was wrong, didn't fill the air with reassurances. Instead, he sat beside her on the hay-strewn floor, his shoulder brushing hers, his silence steady and unyielding. The warmth of his presence seeped into her, and though neither spoke, Clara felt the ache in her chest ease just enough for her to breathe again. The next morning, life carried on as if nothing had passed between them, yet everything felt subtly altered. Silas's gaze lingered longer. His gestures toward her carried a tenderness too deliberate to be accidental. She found herself studying his hands, broad, calloused, gentle when he mended a fence or cradled a newborn foal. The way he moved through the world, measured and unhurried, spoke to something in her she hadn't realized was starving, the longing to be chosen not for beauty or charm, but for quiet worth. That worth was tested the following week when trouble came to town. Clara had ridden in to collect flour and lamp oil, her list clutched in one hand, when she noticed a shift in the air. A group of unfamiliar men lounged near the hitching posts, their laughter sharp, their boots too clean for honest work. Their eyes followed her as she passed, and unease prickled her skin. She hurried through her errands, but as she stepped back outside, one of the men intercepted her. He leaned against the doorframe, blocking her path, his grin predatory. "Pretty little thing," he drawled, his gaze crawling over her like grease. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her heart thudding. She clutched her parcels tighter, trying to step past him, but he shifted to block her again. "Don't be shy," he taunted, reaching to tilt her chin up. Before she could speak, a voice like thunder split the air. "Step away from her." Silas stood several feet away, his stance loose, but radiating a danger that made the man hesitate. The other drifters straightened, their laughter faltering. Silas strode forward, each step deliberate, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his revolver. Now, the man's smirk faltered. He raised his hands in mock surrender, but stepped aside. "Didn't mean no harm, Boone," he said, but his tone was sour. Silas didn't respond, his eyes never leaving the man's until Clara was safely behind him. He guided her to the wagon, his hand firm at her back. The ride home was silent, but Clara noticed his hands trembling on the reins, not with fear, but with the fury of someone who'd seen too much harm in his life to tolerate even the hint of it again. Back at the ranch, Clara slipped from the wagon, her legs unsteady. Silas was there instantly, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You all right?" he asked softly. His voice was rough, threaded with emotion he rarely let slip. Clara nodded, though her throat ached. She looked up at him, at the man who had stood like a storm between her and danger, and something inside her shifted. She wasn't just tolerated, she was treasured. The realization left her breathless. Later that night, she found him on the porch, staring out at the moonlit fields. Without thinking, she stepped closer and placed a hand lightly on his arm. He glanced down, surprised, but didn't pull away. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't reply, only covered her hand with his own, his rough palm warm against her fingers. That simple gesture said more than words ever could. In the days that followed, their connection deepened, not through declarations, but through shared silences and small acts. Silas began to seek her out, asking her opinion on matters of the ranch, her voice carrying weight in decisions that once seemed far beyond her reach. Clara, in turn, found herself caring for him in ways that transcended duty, setting aside his favorite biscuits at supper, mending his shirt with careful stitches, learning the rhythms of his quiet moods. Missy, perceptive as ever, said nothing, but Clara caught her watching them with a faint smile. It was as though the entire ranch was slowly bending toward something inevitable, a bond being forged in the quiet moments between work and dusk. But it wasn't until a town gathering weeks later that everything shifted. Clara had dressed in her best, a pale blue dress Eleanor once wore, the fabric soft from years of careful washing. She stood near the back of the hall, clutching a cup of lemonade, when she heard the whispers. Poor Silas Boone. Could have had the pretty one. Another voice snickered, settled for the shadow. Clara froze, shame surging through her like a wave. Before she could retreat, Silas stepped forward. His voice, calm yet commanding, silenced the room. "That's enough." The murmurs died instantly. He turned toward the whisperers, his gaze steady, his jaw set. "Clara is my wife-to-be. Speak ill of her again, and you'll answer to me." The hall fell utterly silent, all eyes on him. Clara's breath caught. Wife-to-be. Afterward, when the gathering ended and the cool night wrapped around them, Clara followed him outside, her heart pounding. "You," she began, but her voice faltered. He turned to her, his expression soft now, almost vulnerable. "Clara," he said quietly, "I don't want you to doubt, not for a moment, why you're here. I want you because you're you, because you make this place a home." Tears stung her eyes, but she didn't try to hide them. Silas stepped closer, cupping her face with work-roughened hands, and for the first time since she'd come west, she felt wholly, undeniably chosen. The kiss he pressed to her forehead was tender and reverent, a promise sealed in the soft glow of lantern light. Later, they sat together on the porch, hand in hand, the prairie stretching before them like an endless sea. The air was thick with the hum of crickets and the scent of blooming sage. Clara rested her head against Silas's shoulder, her heart calm. She thought back to the frightened girl who had stepped off the stagecoach weeks ago, feeling like nothing more than a placeholder for her sister's life. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had been seen, valued, and chosen, not for beauty or pretense, but for the quiet strength she had carried all along. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes lifted their voices, but tonight their song felt like a hymn, a benediction over the land and the lives it cradled. Clara closed her eyes and let the warmth of Silas's hand anchor her, a silent vow between them that no gossip, no shadow could undo. If ever there comes a day when you feel small, forgotten, or unworthy, remember her story. Love, like the western sky, does not come in a blaze for all to see. Sometimes it rides in quiet, steady as a tired horse, and chooses us long before we believe we are worth the choosing. And when it does, it changes everything.